All right, good evening, gentlemen. So, where are we at? We are working our way through Reformation period. We've gotten into 1600s. We've come through 16th century, 17th century. We have seen Reformation in Wittenberg with Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon. We've discussed that in great length. We've come through after that Zurich in Switzerland with Zwingli, and we find the Anabaptists there as well. Then we moved on into, Calvin, who was kind of second-gen reformer, about 25 years younger than Zwingli and Luther, and he is also in Switzerland. Remember, in Geneva, that's where we primarily think of Calvin's work, although he wanted to go to Strasbourg, and remember, really wanted nothing to do with Geneva, and had a rough go of it there for a while. But we know that God had him there and used him greatly there. And so we've come through Geneva, Zurich, Germany, and now last week we started talking about the English Reformation, and we'll get into the Scottish Reformation a little bit tonight as well. And we're starting to see intersection of church history and kind of secular history, and we're seeing that for a reason, as you'll see the transition that we're making. We're getting into a key and crucial time period here, where, remember, the difference in the English transformation from the others that we've seen is that it was primarily political. Remember, Henry VIII is in charge in England, and he wants to get a divorce from his wife Catherine because she was not able, in his mind, to give him an heir, to give him a son, to have an heir to the throne. And so he wants to get an annulment in his mind, or get a divorce. And the Pope and the church say, no, we're not going to allow you to get a divorce. And so he says, okay, well, to heck with you guys. We're not going to be with you guys anymore. And so he breaks off, and the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, is started. And also in that we'll see the birth of the Episcopal Church, okay, Episcopalian governance and Episcopalian Church. So that starts, and he is named now, Henry is now the head of the Church of England. So again, political, not like he was converted or had some story like Luther and Zwingli and he wants reform in the church to break out of the heresies of the Roman Catholic system. He just wants to break free from the Catholic system because they weren't with him and didn't let him do what he wanted to do. So he appoints men that would let him do what he wanted to do. He gets that divorce, and we know that he's going to marry several other times, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of that tonight, because moving through and forward tonight, you're going to see the significance. As I said, as we're transitioning into this time period, we're going to talk a lot about these kings and queens of England, and then getting into Scotland as well, because this is an important time getting into kind of American history, because we've talked a little bit about the Puritans. We're going to talk about them more tonight as well as we get into more of England. Because what's going to happen is they are going to leave there to make their way to New England, right? To come to what we know as the United States, to come to America, okay? To come to the New World. So we're getting up to that point here shortly, maybe tonight or next week. So that's kind of the key. And in that, remember that just like Martin Luther stood on shoulders of other men, same with the thing here in England. We know that it's a political thing that happens, and I'm going to show you the back and forth that's going to go with that, with Catholicism and Protestantism. But remember, even a couple hundred years before that, in England, we have John Wycliffe, who, remember, wrote the English manuscripts by hand to translate them into the language of the people. Then, about 150 years or so later, you have William Tyndale, who had the Bible published in English. Okay, so the New Testament in English. And he also worked with a man named Miles Coverdale, also in Geneva, and we get the Geneva Bible from there, actually, from John Fox and John Knox, John Calvin being instrumental in that as well. So anyways, with the influence of these men just continuing, God's continuing to use them to get the Bible and to get the Bible into the language of the people through this time of Reformation. Okay, so we're going to pick up from there. Last week we saw with Henry VIII being in charge, he was trying to break free, but again, he was still Catholic, so there were no really reforms going on in the church. And so a lot of groups that were there wanted that to happen, but it did not. Okay, he dies, and now we get to Edward VI. Edward VI is Henry's son. And recall from last week, as I just kind of briefly mentioned it, he has, I think it was 6 marriages, okay? So he has children, and specifically the first 3 wives, those children are going to be significant in this. And Edward VI is the first one. So he finally gets a son, and it takes his 3rd wife to do it, okay? Jane Seymour is the name of his 3rd wife. And she finally gives him an heir to the throne. And so when he dies, Edward becomes king. And kind of a last week, but Josiah and Joash, or several of the kings that we find in the lineage of the Old Testament, the kings of Israel. A lot of them were young, And so with that, we see age of 9, Edward becomes king. Okay, so he's under the tutelage and under the supervision of his uncle. And his uncle was Protestant, as was his mother, Jane Seymour. So he has kind of Protestant leanings, and it's going to be kind of like this pendulum. Okay, we're going to see this pendulum swinging to where it was Catholic, and then Henry wants to break free from that, but he doesn't really, because again, it's not about anything except political things for him, and so it stays Catholic. But now his son comes in, and the pendulum swings back again over to the Protestant side now. And I say again, I should say for the first time here. So they're going into Protestant reforms, okay, under Edward. So we're going to see this back and forth continue to go. But he does start reforms, and they start to break free from the Catholic system that was in place there for so long. And now in 1553, he doesn't live very long. He dies at the age of 15. Okay, so he was sick for a long time, and we've seen that kind of common thread at this time of a lot of sickness. And remember, there was a lot of plagues and a lot of things going on. A lot of people lost their lives due to things like that. So this young man becomes the boy king, if you will, at age 9. He dies at the age of 15. So now what's going to happen is one of Henry VIII's other children are going to come in, because remember, we're still in that, and actually that's called the Tudor line in England, and probably Pete would know that more than I would.
Tudor.
What's that? What'd you say?
It's Tudor, actually.
Oh, the Tudors. So he dies, and so now what's going to happen is one of the daughters are going to become next in line. Okay, Mary the First. This is Edward's sister, and she is his older sister. This is the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine, the one that he wanted to divorce because she did not have a son. Well, they did have a daughter, and her name was Mary the First. What does she become known as, Pete?
Mary Queen of Scots.
Yep, Mary's Queen of Scots, and what's her nickname?
Bloody Mary.
Right, Bloody Mary. Right, okay, so, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit here. So she becomes queen, and she goes and undoes all the reforms that Edward, her brother, did. So she's going to swing everything back to Catholicism because she's still Roman Catholic. So we're going to see kind of this ping pong match, just this pendulum going from sibling to sibling as we do this. So Henry VIII is on the Catholic. His son Edward comes in, and he's Protestant. And now he dies, his sister comes in, and she's Catholic. So she's going to swing everything back to the Catholic system to restore that and stop all the changes that her brother was making. Okay, she is called Bloody Mary because, and she actually only reigned for a short time. She reigned for about 5 years. But in that 5 years, she's known to have killed and executed over 300 Protestant leaders. Okay, in a span of 5 years. And when I say that, I mean actually exactly that. Sorry, Sam, I can go back for it. I mean exactly that. We hear, man, 300 Protestants, that seems like pretty bad, in which it would be, but these are Protestant leaders. These are the prominent people in the Protestant church that are there in England. And she just starts taking out all the most important, significant people in the Protestant church. Okay, so it was very evil, very bad, and so for the life of the church there, the Protestant church, they were under severe persecution and obviously fear of Mary, and hence she gets this label, Bloody Mary.
She burned at the stake. Didn't she burn a lot?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah, and which because remember that was the Catholic thing, right? The Roman Catholics were the ones who were burning at the stake, and when we went back to the Anabaptists and all that, remember they would drown them, but yeah, she was Catholic, and so they would definitely use that as means of execution most of the time. So with that going on, you can understand the turmoil that the Protestants are under, right, and the persecution that's happening now to the Protestants. So they're going to flee. And we talked about this a little bit because we had to get ahead of ourselves because we talked about Calvin a couple weeks ago. But Calvin was very instrumental in this because remember, where's Calvin at? Remember? What city do we associate Calvin with? Geneva. Right, Geneva. Okay, so he's in Geneva at this time. You just needed a minute to look at your notes. So a lot of these Protestants, they flee from there to get away from Mary, and they go to Geneva, a lot of them, because they can find shelter there with Calvin there, because he's Protestant. And so a lot of them go there from England, and this would be the group that's going to become known as the Puritans. We mentioned that last week, and we're going to talk about them more here later tonight. So the Puritans come from England, and they are essentially English refugees that find themselves leaving and going to Switzerland, and a lot of them end up going, again, to Geneva with Calvin because he's there, and he's already been reforming the church, and it's a Protestant city-state. So they can find safety there. Because remember, the problem was they had to try to find places where they would be safe. Right, the safe havens were if you're a Protestant, you got to find a safe haven for the Protestants because you can't just go over to a Roman Catholic place because you're still going to have problems. Because remember, with the church and the state, the synergistic way that they were, if you were not in line with them in the church, then you weren't in line with them with the state. So if you were, deemed a heretic in the church, remember you were deemed a traitor in the nation. So you could be executed and punished accordingly. So you had to be. If this church state if this city state is Catholic, then you're Catholic, or you're going to be put in prison, or you're going to be killed, or you flee and you leave and you got to find somewhere else to go that's not Catholic. Okay, which was a difficult thing at the beginning because there's only certain little spots that are Protestant, but now we see that the Lord is just spreading these things out, and there's Protestant places popping up, so they can go and they can find refuge and safety in these places. So a lot of the English refugees go over to Geneva, and they end up getting obviously influenced by Calvin when they get over there. Okay, so we'll talk more about them in just a minute. I find it important, I wanted to mention this, we've talked about Fox's Book of Martyrs several times. So John Fox is at this time that we're talking about now with Bloody Mary and all these Protestant leaders being martyred and being killed. This is when he writes that book. And he does so because he wants to get a testimony and get account of these men's lives and what they sacrificed and what they gave in their martyrdom. Okay, so for many of us who have read some of that, maybe you've looked at it a lot, maybe you haven't, you can go online and look and find out a lot of details about a lot of the men that we've talked about and so many others of the faithful leaders at that time that were martyred. Okay, so that is the time that happens.
What year is this about?
It is, here, let me not speak off the top of my...
Okay.
1553 is when Edward dies. Okay, so her reign lasts for about 5 years after that. So it's going to be about 1558, 1559 or so when we get to the next ruler. So you're talking, mid-1550s, mid-16th century, middle 16th century. So not too long after, and I actually have a timeline up here that I'll show you in a little bit to maybe help us out. But not too long after, remember this is all just kind of starting to really make headway. We think of, again, who do we think of primarily when we think of Reformation? What's the first name that usually pops to mind? Luther. And what year are we talking about with the 95 Theses in Luther? Close. 1517.
That's what.
So 1517 is Luther, and so you're talking about 40 years or so after that is where we're at. Okay. So in this 4 or 5 generations, whatever, 4 or 5 decades, we're seeing the Reformation, across what we know as like Europe, in our modern map. You're just seeing it spread out and spreading out from there.
Great, good question.
Yeah.
A little bit of. Weren't the Anabaptists part of the Protestant Reformation? Aren't they Protestant?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we talked about them already, and we'll get back to them because, yes, remember they stemmed out of Zurich with Zwingli. Zwingli was making reforms in Switzerland, and that's when we talked about the Anabaptists because they broke out from that because they wanted more reforms than Zwingli was willing to push. The city council did not allow that, but the Anabaptists were, against infant baptism. They wanted to do believers' baptism, and so a lot of them fled. But yeah, they're by no means gone. They're still there, and they're actually in England, and a lot of them are part of the Puritans. And then once we'll fast forward a little bit here, and just understand now, let me back up a minute. Understand now from the beginning, we now have Lutheran, right, from Luther in Germany. We have Zwingli, then we have Calvin. Okay, now when we get to the English Reformation, now we see the Episcopal is going to start. We're going to get into the Scottish Reformation here in a little bit. That's going to start Presbyterianism. So we're starting to see those kinds of things happen. We were talking a little bit, and then John and I were talking about it too as well with the Baptists, because that's going to happen too. John Smith is going to come from, he was Dutch, he's going to come from the Netherlands and come to America with this, we'll get to that eventually soon here, but Puritans, and a lot of them come over, and Smith was in the Netherlands, was influenced by the Anabaptists. That's where Baptist comes from. So that's going to come over to America. Baptist comes from that. Anabaptist was before that. So that's kind of like a Cliff Notes version. We can unpack more later. But
The Episcopal was mainly, it was like a lot of Catholic.
there's a lot of Catholic similarities, sure, certainly, and we're going to talk about that more tonight. So essentially, when we think of Episcopal, they're talking about the governance structure. And what that means is that there is the hierarchy. Okay, there's bishops and archbishops and cardinals, kind of like the Catholic system, going up to the Pope leading the church. Well, right now in this Anglican church, the Church of England we're talking about, it's the same thing. They've set it up similar because the Pope's not the head of the church. Who's the head of the Church of England? The king or the queen. So they're the self-proclaimed head of the church. So that's why you'll see the Puritans and all these people still have a problem with them. And we'll get into that more later. Because they stay for quite a while, and they're okay with some of it, but it gets worse and worse and worse. So the Episcopal thing is that hierarchy of the church governance, of the church clergy.
And the priests can marry. The priests can marry.
Well, all that's going to change later. Yeah. So all the details and nuances of denominations, they don't start right at the beginning. So that'll all come later. Yeah, but particularly it's mostly in this time, it just kind of mimics Catholicism because they really haven't broken free with all these reforms. They get a little of them, and some of them will go and keep going on them, but some of them just won't. They say, you know what, they're too caught up in the Catholic tradition, and they'll do little reforms, but we're still going to do what we do. And you're going to find that in England for sure to be the case, okay, in the Church of England. That's what's going to happen.
They changed actually to vicars, not to priests.
Right. Yep. They just changed the names,
So it could,
and they don't have cardinals. They have like archbishops, and they have vicars, and they change the names, but it's the same structure.
Yeah.
It's the same structure. It just mimics Catholicism.
The king just did that right away, right? Like the divorce thing, he just boom.
Well, Henry VIII did, right, when he broke off Catholicism, and he said, I'm the head of the church, but they still were Catholic, but he just didn't want the Pope authority and all that stuff. But then his son started reforms like Protestant, but then he died, and it went back with Mary, his first daughter, and she was staunch Roman Catholic and was killing the Protestants, and so it went back to the Catholic system until she died, and now that's where we're going to pick up now.
Not even Episcopal.
Yep. So it's kind of the birth of the Episcopal Anglican English Church. We're going to see that it keeps going back and forth here for a little bit, but now that's going to stop now. With Elizabeth, it's going to be Protestant, and now it's going to stay, and it's going to continue to transform the church. Okay, so this is Elizabeth. This is, so now Mary, here's what it looks like. His first wife, Catherine, has a daughter. They have a daughter, Mary. Second wife, Anne Boleyn. They have another daughter, Elizabeth. Then his third wife is Jane Seymour. They finally have a son, Edward. So the son is heir to the throne above women. Yes, that was always the system. So Edward is actually the third youngest in the family, but he gets the throne. He dies. That oldest sister gets to take the throne. Then she dies. Now the next oldest sister gets to be. So this is Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn. This is their daughter. Okay, so as I said, the thing you need to remember is, we're not going to remember all this, and I understand that it's a lot. The only reason we bring it up is because you're going to see these three children of Henry VIII are playing huge, significant roles in the Protestant movement and non-movement in England, because one was Protestant, the other one wasn't. Now we get to Elizabeth, she is, and then she's going to continue on that pace, and then things are going to pick up, and things are going to truly change from that point forward. Now, not to the point of where the Puritans or some of us might want it to be changed, but it does change from the Roman Catholic thing. Okay, so they're hugely significant, and that's why we bring them up in this study and in this time, because the Reformation in England isn't like the Reformation in Germany, where you have Luther who's convicted and he wants to change the church. In England, this is how it happened. It was a political battle and struggle for a couple families with the Tudor line, and then after that, whatever the next line of them is, it's going to come to King James and King Charles and all of them. They're no longer Tudors. Maybe Pete knows, maybe not. We can look it up later. But anyways, that's where that Reformation in England starts. It's just a different way. It was just political fiasco, and then the Lord ended up using it. Yeah, so it looks much different. So you're not going to be tested on all the names. Just remember that Henry VIII, which most of you talked about the song last week, the Henry VIII song and all the wives, and so his kids were going to be instrumental to be used. Bloody Mary in not such a good way towards Protestants, but Elizabeth will be better now. Okay, so she goes back to reforming as her brother Edward did, and is changing all the things that her sister Mary wrecked and ruined. Okay, so now what happens is all the English refugee groups, the Protestant groups that had to flee from Mary and leave, well, they're all welcome to come back home now, right? Because now England is Protestant. So now we're Protestant. Now you guys can come home. And again, those would be the Puritans. So now they are finally able to come back home to England. And this is now when Reformation truly gets rooted in England, and changes start to happen in the church. But again, there's still men and there's still women, and it's never perfect. And she gets a new title because they felt that a woman could not be called the head of the church or the head of something, even though she was the queen. But they give her the title Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which essentially is the same exact thing, right? We're just talking about different titles. It really means nothing. You're still using that same tainted governance structure of the king or the queen or the pope or whoever it is, any person being the head of the church, because we know that that's not right. Christ is the head of the church, and no one speaks for his church other than him. And it's not the pope, it's not the queen, it's not the king, but yet they wanted to keep that power structure in place. And of course, if you're the queen, you like that, and you want to keep the power structure, right? We all want to be the king, we all want to be the queen, we all want to be in charge of everything. We want a cool label like Supreme Governor or head of the Anglican Church. So of course that sounds good to them, and they want to do it, right? Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, let us build a 90-foot statue to you so we can drop and worship it all the time. No, you guys shouldn't do that, right? No, they want to do that. Like, yeah, let's do that. Build a big statue for me? You're going to bow and worship me? Yeah, let's do that. So they like it, and so a lot of the reforms that we're thinking of when we think of Reformation, we think of the Protestant Reformation and changes to the church. I've said this from the beginning, but we're tending to see it more and more and more. And then in the deeper kind of doctrinal, theological discussions you can have with pastors or with church historians or theologians and things, you can see. I mean, the Protestants broke out of Roman Catholicism, but so much of the baggage, doctrinally and all, still came. It's still coming, because again, it's hard to unlearn what you've learned and reshape it and retrain it to Scripture, and that's what we all want to try to do. But it's really hard, and it didn't happen in a lot of these places in the way that it should. Okay, so we see that continuing to be the case. So she puts down some guidelines and says that everyone must attend church. Sounds good, right? So you must attend the Anglican Church, and so Anglican Church just means Church of England. Okay, so the Anglican Church, you'll hear me using that kind of interchangeably. The Anglican Church is the Church of England, and so they want you to attend that each week. Now, some of these Protestant groups, the Puritans that we're talking about specifically, think that there should be much more reform than what's happening. So what does this sound like? This sounds like the Anabaptists in Zwingli, okay, which we were just kind of recapping. The Anabaptists were getting on Zwingli because they wanted more reform, and you said let's stick to the Bible and do what it says, but you're not doing it. And we know how that went for them. It didn't end up well for quite a long time. Okay, with Calvin, we had the Libertines. Remember, Calvin had the Libertines against him that were against his reforms, and they ended up taking the city council over, remember, making life really hard for Calvin. It was terrible until God changed that and got the Libertines out of there. So we see the same thing here. The Puritans want more, and Elizabeth and the state churches than they're willing to give. And their big complaints were exactly what we're talking about. These weren't minor little things in their view, nor should they be in our view. It was essentially the head of the church was the big deal. The authority of the church, who is it? Is it the queen or the king, or is it Christ? Is it the pope, or is it Christ? It's the same things. What is our authority? Is it Scripture is our authority, or is it the counsels and the words that you say is our authority? So there's still major issues going on with that. So even when Luther broke out of Catholicism and on with Zwingli and the Anabaptists, same thing here. And so while there are reforms going and things seem to be going away from Catholicism and into a good direction, there's still hesitancy and there's still things that don't happen. Because again, we're men and we're women, and they don't want to change, they don't want to lose the power. And so that's going to be the struggle that will ensue for quite some time. Okay? And these, I kind of already mentioned it earlier, but these groups, these Protestant kind of groups that want that and desire that, in particular we're talking about the Puritans, that's going to be very instrumental, okay, in the settling of the colonies in what's going to be known as America. So in the establishment of the American church and the colonies in America, again, they try to rewrite history books and all for the public schools and for all the schools for that matter. They, the liberals and the government, they want to change history, but we know history. The fact is that already at this time, we talk about the Mayflower. Those people were coming over because they were seeking religious freedom. Okay, the Puritans and all these people, they are trying to escape, tyranny, and they're trying to escape all the stuff that's coming against them. And now, even though things are kind of going the right way, it's still not enough. And so they still want to reform things and get to the Bible and start reforms over and over in the church that aren't being welcomed. Yeah. So that's going to be a big deal and a big driving force for them to leave, which is, what's going to start the United States of America.
Where's King James? Isn't he?
We're getting to him. Oh, he's not there yet.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. He's not there yet. He will be. So, because he's not going to be for a little bit later, the early 1600s, and we're almost there, but we're like 1560s or so right now. So we'll be there in like 40 years.
1650, they overthrew the king and Cromwell had Cromwell's model army instead of parliamentarians and tried to kill the king.
Yeah, right. So we're not there yet.
No.
Right.
Back, it's the same.
Right, James and then Charles, James II, Charles II, yep, all that, and the Puritan, that kind of civil war there that happened, in 49 to, whatever it was, 42 to 49, right? That's what you're talking about, like 1650-ish?
It was 1650 when Oliver Cromwell formed my regiment at Colchester Guards, and they were Puritan, they were the parliamentarians at that time.
Right, yep.
They changed in the 1720s.
Good, yep, exactly. Yep, we're getting there, and you can help us unpack some of that.
There's a great documentary I saw it, I forget what it's called, but it showed how challenging it was when the Puritans were leaving. They had to wait for the right time. I remember they tried it one time, it didn't work. Tried another time, it didn't work.
Yeah, there'll be a couple waves. They
Yeah.
did go once, but then there'll be a bigger one. Yeah.
There's a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't want to let anybody leave with any money, because all the money belonged to the oh wow. That's what they were stealing money from England.
Yep. But the driving force behind it all, is what we're focusing on and recognizing
absolutely.
is
Is
the religious freedom, that they wanted to worship God, but to also have church and teach and preach the Bible, and to have people change it to where it is biblically correct. And it just wasn't happening. Just wasn't happening. So, yeah, that's going to be instrumental in that push for them to leave. Okay, so that's how the English Reformation begun and kind of went that route. We'll get back to it here shortly. Let's talk briefly about the Scottish Reformation. England, Scotland at that time, we're definitely going to see they were at odds for quite a while, 16th century. And Scotland takes up allies with France. Excuse me. And when we think about Scotland and the Scottish Reform, quiz time, recap time, you think of Wittenberg and Germany reform. You think of who? Who's German? First reform. Right, Martin Luther. You think of Zurich, Switzerland. We think of who? Zwingli. Okay. We also should think of a little bit later Calvin, because he was in Geneva in Switzerland also. So you've got Calvin there after that as well. So we've heard, you think of England, we're going to think of Henry VIII and just the political way that went. When we talk about Scotland, we're talking about John Knox. That's who you're going to think of. First name that should pop into our mind is John Knox. Okay. Scottish man, and it definitely, his temperament was kind of that stereotypical Scottish temperament. So very loud, very boisterous, very over the top, very bold. Excuse me. Here is his. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, you're good.
You just catch his name, and then we'll have him here. Here's his dates. So you can see around the same time. Remember what God is doing here. It's just spreading like wildfire, and it's like that fire that he ignited in all these men. You see it with Zwingli and Luther, born at the same time. Look at the years there. John Knox, 1513. What was the year that Luther pinned the things to the door? 95 Theses to the door? 1517. Right there. Okay, so same time frame that we're talking about. So this is what's happening now in Scotland. John Knox, like several of the men we've already talked about, was trained as a priest. And remember that most of their fathers were telling them to be either priests or lawyers, because that was financially a good thing at that time. So he was trained as a priest. We know that he's converted at some point. He becomes a preacher, in the Protestant church. Significant story that I want to share here about Knox is he was part of a group that were attacked by Roman Catholics. Supposedly he was not part of the group that they did some acts of violence against the Catholics, but he was known to be with that group, but not during this time. But either way, he got captured and taken with this group by the Roman Catholics, and they actually got punished by being made to be slaves in the galley of a ship for 2 years. And so you see, at a French ship. And so you see those like old movies, with like the guys down in the galley and they're all rowing and they're whipping them, and they're the ones doing all the labor to kind of cross the waters and stuff. That was John Knox and his group for 2 years. Okay, so they got punished in that way. And so they were slaves and they were treated harshly, and they did that for a period of 2 years. Then, however, they were released, and so he goes back to England under Edward VI. So we've already talked about Edward, right? So we're kind of backtracking a little bit. You saw the years of Knox's life. We're backtracking a little bit to kind of bring this all together. because this English and Scottish Reformation are going on simultaneously. Okay, so Knox is in England under the time of Edward. So remember, Edward is that first king after Henry. He's the son, and he is Protestant. So that votes well for Knox, yes? That's good for him. He's okay. But we know what's going to happen. Edward's going to die, and who's going to take over? Mary. That's not going to be good for him, because we know what she was doing to people that were Protestant. Okay, so she's going to take over, and here's where we got some paths across that we talked about a couple weeks ago, but we're going to unpack it more today. So Knox leaves England now when Mary comes into power, and he goes to Geneva. Well, why is that significant? Because who's in Geneva? Calvin. Okay, so John Knox is now with John Calvin, and we know that that's going to be a huge influence on Knox when he comes back to Scotland eventually. Okay, so Calvin was just a huge influence at this time on so many. I mean, the Puritans from England, Knox from Scotland, all these groups that are seeking safety from Roman Catholicism and the Roman Catholic, oppression and persecution that they're suffering from. A lot of them, the Lord leads them to Calvin in Geneva. So he goes back now to Scotland after Mary dies, because remember what happens. That pendulum's going to swing back. Mary dies, Elizabeth comes in, and boom, now we're Protestant again. So now he's able, just like the other Puritans, he's able to come back into safety, back to England where he wants to be. Make sense? Questions, thoughts on that? While you're catching up on your... See a lot of writers, so that's good. So that makes sense, right? We just have this ping pong again, just back and forth, back and forth. So when it's Roman Catholic, they can't be there and they got to leave. When they find out that boom, it's back to Protestant, then they can come home. And it's just kind of this life, that they're kind of on the run and having to flee at times, and then they're safe at times. But again, all under the sovereign hand of God, who is orchestrating the whole thing according to his will, to put them in places at specific times and get them together to encourage one another. I'm sure, the time that they spent for a few years there, because Mary was in charge for 5 years. So you got a few years of period of time there where Knox and these Puritans are in Geneva with can all be thriving. God bless you. They can all be thriving together and encouraging one another in keeping each other strong in the faith. Okay, so that had to be a huge, awesome thing for them as well.
It's like the same theme all the way back in, the Bible, just God using persecution to spread, the way He wants to spread it.
It sounds just like Acts, right? We already went through that in Acts, the persecution that drove the disciples and drove the word out to be spread abroad. And certainly that's a great analogy, Sam, because we've seen, again, if we refer to the Dark Ages as the time that God's Word was kind of hidden, and now we get into the time of Reformation where there's this awakening and this revival going on. Well, remember, why was that? Because God's Word was now becoming, awakening and coming out of that darkness. So certainly we're going to see that He's going to spread that in whatever fashion He chooses to spread it. And it seems certainly that persecution seems to be a way that He tends to like to do that. Some of us were talking about that at lunch today.
Doesn't leave a lot of choice, what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, you can go or you can die.
Yeah, you're going to Geneva whether you think you are or you're not.
Well, if you think about it, that's the thing. If you think about it, we would like to be comfortable. So if we're not being persecuted, or if we're comfortable, we're going to stay there.
Right.
And we're going to keep it there with us.
Right.
So
Exactly.
persecution
Yep.
forces you to go outward.
Exactly. Yeah, we had, 6 of us today? We had 6 pastors today having lunch meeting in Marathon, and we talked about that a little bit. Exactly right. Exactly right.
He also uses that to draw you close to Him sometimes too. Like, a lot of people,
Yep.
a lot of people come to Christ like that.
Yep. Good. So we see Knox come back to Scotland, and he will start preaching and teaching reform in Scotland. And now this, I've noted here for you, is the birth of the Presbyterian Church. And again, all the nuances and distinctives and doctrinal differences and things that come about over the last 400 years or however many hundred years these denominations have been around, those things are going to continue to change. So it's not like when you say, oh, the Presbyterian Church, right off the bat we're thinking about, what you may think of the Presbyterian Church today. Okay, the Presbyterian Church historically essentially has always been Scottish Calvinism. Okay, so we're talking about what we call Reformed theology, which back then they just called what? Theology. They just called Scripture. So what we refer to as Reformed theology or Calvinistic theology was historically always there in the Presbytery of Scotland. Okay, but that's significant because now we're seeing Lutheran, right? We're seeing Reformed theology. We're seeing Calvin being put in that mix, obviously, too. We've seen the Episcopal Church starting in England. We're seeing the Presbyterian Church starting in Scotland. So you see here's the birth of all these things that we're talking about. I've already kind of mentioned the Baptist thing. And so we're just going to continue to see that. And then again, doctrinal distinctives and all that stuff will keep perpetuating on and on and on. Okay. And we've already mentioned that as well. But John Knox was definitely instrumental as the Puritans and as some of these others in the development in the church in America and coming over in the birth of the United States and all those things. Okay, so when we talk about the founding fathers, in that discussion that we always have about, or hear for so many years about, they were seeking religious freedom and they were Christians who founded this nation. And, I know the left for years wants to deny that and they want to say, they came over killing Indians and whatever the argument is, historically, the truth is that is what they were doing. Okay, and they were Christians, they were Protestants who were coming over and founding this country and this, New England, right? Yeah, Scott.
So would you say like that the Anabaptists would be like the closest kind of ancestry to the Baptist church?
Sure. Yeah, because in that the way and that's where it comes from. I mean that's where they're coming from. So, the Southern Baptists or, whatever the Baptist lineage is that they kind of trace back to John Smythe and coming from there. He's coming from the Netherlands from the Anabaptists. Because they were the first ones that remember what the whole thing is. So when we're talking about Baptists, what our big distinctive is we're talking about is what? Believer's baptism, right? Not infant baptism. That would be kind of the main leg of what you're talking about. Well, who was that did that? Anabaptists. They were the first ones that did that. They were saying infant baptism is nowhere in the scriptures. It's to be believer's baptism. So, and remember the word Anabaptist meant rebaptizers, right? Because they were saying, well, you're just rebaptizing people that had already been baptized. And they're saying, no, they were never baptized because they weren't believers. So, that whole discussion again. But yes, for ease sake, yes, certainly. Baptists came from Anabaptists.
And so about the Episcopal Church, technically they're Protestant, but they're so close to Catholic.
Right, from that Church of England, the Anglican Church. Yeah. And so, and that's why this will be important because we'll talk about it a little bit more later, and so we'll understand it more. So, especially what we're talking about in the Episcopal sense of the Church of England is the church governance structure. So the structure of the liturgy, which would be, anybody know what liturgy is? I don't have to suck up all the air. Anybody know what does that mean when we talk about church liturgy or Roman Catholic liturgy or something like that?
Is that like doctrine, like what their beliefs?
It's essentially the method of worship. So it's we're going to talk about this Book of Common Prayer. So they had this thing called the Book of Common Prayer, and that defined their liturgy. So it essentially said, this is what we do in church. This is what we do in worship service. This is what it looks like. So a lot of us are familiar with Roman Catholicism. It would be, we sit, kneel, stand, we speak in Latin, we pray this prayer, we do this thing, we take communion, then we confess, and then we leave. So you have your order of service, essentially, is what we're talking about. That would be your liturgy. And so their liturgy would be called Episcopal, which would be Roman Catholic liturgy. They would have those things in their service still. Their governance structure of authority in the church would be called Episcopal. And that means there's Episcopal governance, there's Presbytery governance, and then there's what we call congregational governance. So those would be the three main ones. And so the point of this is Episcopal would be what we talked about earlier with the hierarchy. You'd have the vicars, the bishops, the archbishops over them, these bishops over them, and you'd have the head being the king or queen. So it's very similar to the Catholic thing. That would be an Episcopal type of governance. A presbytery type of governance would be something where you have like elder-led. You would have a board of elders or multiple pastors, and then there's different nuances and variances to that as well, to where they would have a board over them or a board over them, and some would not. For instance, you could call our church here, we have 3 pastors co-pastoring. That's a form of presbytery leadership. Okay, but we don't answer to a board and they answer to a board. We don't do a hierarchy presbytery kind of governance, but it would be called a presbytery governance. Okay, so the important thing to remember here is the Episcopal one, because that's going to come back here in a moment. We're going to see why it's important. Okay, so when you think Episcopalian, that's what I'm trying to get you to think, is that they just have this hierarchy.
It's just governors.
Yes.
But yeah, to me, in my head, I kind of tie them right to the Catholic religion because of their belief in works rather than faith.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Right, and so that's what I mean. Their distinctives and their doctrine and all that stuff will continue to change and be defined. But for right now, that's a good framework to start with. That it definitely parallels the Catholic system.
Right. Pretty much Catholic with a different governor.
Yeah, yeah. And then they'll change things that won't be Catholic, but at this time they're very Catholic still. They just like Pete said, they just renamed things. They just
Even today, you can't tell the difference between a Catholic church and a church
Yeah.
church. Just they're all fancy and,
Oh yeah,
you know.
yeah. The look is definitely all the same. They would just have some different beliefs.
I did notice some different, like, my in-laws are very Catholic, and I respect it. The children are some shit.
Right.
Catholic Church is, hey, you swear to raise this child up in the Catholic Church.
Right.
In the Episcopal Church that we did last time, they said that you promising to raise your child up Christian. So I thought it was that was Catholic.
Yeah, and there's certainly differences
Kind of
Yeah.
a bridge.
in Episcopalian
Yeah, it's a
and
little
Roman
bit- it was a little
Catholicism,
bit- They did that for
Yeah.
me. It was smoother.
but there's very many similarities as well. Good.
So the
That's
Puritans,
why I asked, because Shannon's working there at Episcopal
Yeah.
Church.
Yep.
And we end up going there to service sometimes, and I'm like, this is like Catholic.
Yep.
I know
Yep.
those Catholic people.
Yep.
so the Presbyterian is over the Puritans, so to speak. Is that right? Am I understanding that? Yes.
Well, the Puritans are in England, and yeah, there's definitely an English-Scotland crossover here. But as far as, sorry, I can go back to that. As far as in Scotland, they're they're reforming there. So yeah, the Puritans are definitely comfortable there now, because John Knox has reformed Scotland. So the Puritans and Knox,
So they're not one and the same?
they're all on the
No.
same page. Yeah.
The Reformed Presbyterians, not Puritans.
Yeah, so they'd be definitely on the same page, but I'm just separating in the sense of you have England and Scotland, but definitely the movement is going and the Protestant Reformation is happening in both of those, and certainly you have Puritans from England and what you would call even Puritans from Scotland, because essentially the Puritans are just English refugees who were fleeing from persecution. And we end up calling them the Puritans, and we'll talk about them here in a minute. I think they're on the next slide, actually.
So I guess I'm just trying to understand where you're, on your slide, it was just saying he was instrumental in the movement of the Puritans, but then just before that it was, he brings strong reform in the theology of the Scotland and the Presbyterian Church.
Right, exactly. Because in England, the church denomination we'll use for now is the Church of England, and so the Episcopalian Church is going to come from that. From Scotland, you're going to have the birth of the Presbyterian Church, but at this time, they would call themselves that. But the overarching thing is Protestantism. That's all that's really defining. Remember, you have the two camps. You have Catholicism and you have Protestantism. Now, what we're seeing in this camp over here now, we'll move over to Protestantism, and now you're going to start seeing different segments now. Protestantism, because they're going to start with different distinctives. Some of them are still going to be okay with infant baptism, some are not. Some are still going to think transubstantiation for communion, some are not. So there's still going to be those things, it's just they're not going to kill each other over it, because they're all going to recognize we're all Protestant, and we'll just separate and stay with well, we like to do it this way, you like to do it this way, then you guys do your thing, we'll do our thing. And so that leads down to like what we are today, you know. But then it just keeps separate, it just keeps separating more and more and more and more. So yeah, thank you, that's a good point. Don't get distracted yet by the terms of Presbyterian, Episcopalian, you know, and all those things. I'm just trying to give you the sense of where those things are being birthed out from moving forward. This is the time frame now that all happens. So where we are at, the 16th century, with the reforms in Scotland and England, you have the start of these two other Protestant denominations. Okay, but they're all entrenched together. Knox, Calvin, the Puritans, they're all in the same team saying we got to reform from Catholicism as much as possible. So they're all in the same gang on that. Yeah, good question, good clarity.
Now we have non-denominational, but you read the statement of faith.
Yeah, right. A non-denominational church is just a Baptist church with a fancy, cool sign. That's all. That's all a non-denominational church is.
Well, I got saved in a non-denominational, but
Yep.
the pastor was basically learned from Johnny Hunt, which was a Baptist church.
Oh yeah.
And,
I'm not even kidding. I mean, that's a
and
real.
he still had ties, obviously, to the Baptist church as well.
99% of non-denominationals use Baptist statements of confessions of faith, and
Right.
whether it's Westminster or Second London Baptist. I mean, that's what they're using.
Right.
Yeah.
But I guess his idea was if you don't have Baptists on there, you're not going to scare anyone.
Yeah.
You call them
It's just trying again to be tolerant and be acceptable, and yep.
All that Protestant stuff, it's all the Scottish and the English. It's all really English because
Right.
Scotland's always been run by England in today.
That's what I'm
They have
saying.
no
It's all
government for
intermixed with them
England.
anyway.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. And that's why even when the English refugees, the Puritans, fled from Mary, a lot of the Scottish did too. And that's how Knox ended up with the Puritans with Calvin in Geneva, because they were all kind of together.
Yeah.
Yeah. It didn't matter whether they were English or Scottish. You know what I mean? They were together. So. Okay, English Christianity, we've talked about this enough. This is going to lead us in our conversation now. We're transitioning now out of kind of this, we're going to get out of this Reformation officially kind of time to where we're now going to be moving forward with English Christianity, because that's what happened here. At the Church of England, reforms are happening. Well, it's there in England, yeah, but where's that coming? It's coming to the United States, right? New England. I mean, that's coming from England. That's the movement we're doing to where now we're going to be moving forward here shortly into the American church, right? You guys with me? So that's what's going to be coming up on our plate here, okay? And then that'll obviously lead us into the modern day church over the next 400 years or so.
So the Crusades, and you had what did they call those knights that had the cross on?
Templar?
The Templar.
Knights Templar?
Were they from the Catholic Church or were they from a Christian church?
Well, remember, it's a good question, because remember the whole Crusades thing, and how, it's a smear, it's a smear to Christianity and a dark spot, and they want to say, oh, you guys killed everybody and blah, 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 but they were, that was the Western Empire, remember, going against the Eastern Empire in the Crusades, and so a lot of them were actually killing each other to try to get the power, because remember there was that deal where they said, pay us and we'll help you fight against your enemies, and they fought, but they couldn't pay them, and so then the one group took over the other group, and the Knights Templar, and there were a couple of segments of knights in that, were just the knights that did all the kind of dirty work, and did the wars and did those things. But yeah, they were Christian, because they were, in fact, remember, met by Muslim forces who were taking over, remember, in the Eastern Empire, as Islam was taken over in that, they were fighting against that and pushing back against them too. But the problem was they turned on each other.
Right, that was the wrong question, right? Because the Catholic Church is Christian and they believe in Christ.
Well, they're not Christian, but
Right.
no. But we could talk about that more later. Because remember we talked about that. They don't believe the true gospel. They believe in the synergistic gospel of Christ. Yes, they believe he died, and they believe that God has a part of sanctification, it has a part of justification, but you also have your part that you have to play in justification, in being saved. You must do this, you must do this, you must do Mass, you must do communion. That's part of your salvation. And so that makes them not Christian. They don't believe the true gospel. Doesn't mean there aren't Christians in the Catholic Church. So don't mishear me. That way.
But if you ask the Catholic Church, they'll say they're Christian.
Of course they will.
Sure,
No. And you ask every statistic and everything that comes out in the world will
They're
say
labeled
that.
as
Yeah,
Christian.
and they throw all denominations into Christianity. You have,
The
if
belief
you're
in
not
Christ.
Jew, if you're not Muslim, you're not Buddhist, you're not Hindu,
Or atheist.
then you're Christian. They just lump everybody into Christianity.
Even Mormons.
Everybody, Jehovah's Witness, everybody's Christianity. Yeah, so that's why we're a quote unquote Christian nation, which is a joke, right? Yeah. Good. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the Puritans and we'll close out. We got 15 minutes. We'll close out, talk about them. We've already touched base on them so much. That should definitely not be late 26th century. That is certainly a typo. That would be late 16th century to the early 18th century is the time frame we're talking about with the Puritans. So a couple hundred years now that we're talking about. And how they actually got the name Puritans, it was a derogatory name actually towards them by the Church of England. So the head authorities and people of the Church of England were saying, well, yeah, you guys are the ones who are trying to purify the church. You know, they were kind of like, you want us to do more than we want to do, and we don't need to do that. We're good with what we are, and you're kind of being the radical. You know, you're the radical Christians that want to change all this stuff, and you want to quote unquote purify the church. And so they just ended up taking that name and using it because they essentially were trying to purify the church, and they didn't see that as something bad. Okay, so that's where the name comes from. They're trying to purify or reform the church. And essentially this time what we're talking about is really the next generation, the second generation of Puritans, because we've seen them already before this, and now their children, the second generation of these Puritans, are really the ones who are going to start putting the pedal to the metal, if you will, and really be pushing for reforms in the Church of England. And when they don't see that happen, they're not going to just give up on it. They're going to be the ones who are going to be like, all right, well then we're out of here, and we're going to go do it ourselves. And so they're really strong in their convictions, and God obviously uses them in the way that He desired to use them, and we all kind of sit here because of that. Okay. I want to see if that even. Okay. I was worried that it's a little blurry, but I was concerned that it probably wouldn't even come out. So here's a quick timeline that hopefully will be more helpful than it is harmful, because we haven't gotten into a lot of this yet, but we will. So 1500 to 1700, and you see up here, here's the point. The Puritans seek to purify the Church of England from elements they consider to still be too close to Roman Catholicism. So we talk about that, but you see the gap here, okay, for this distant of time. We start in 1517 with Luther and the 95 Theses. Okay, we get to 1519. So again, remember, same time frame. 1519, you got Zwingli coming into Zurich, and the reforms start there. Then you have 1534, we talked about Henry VIII being declared as the head of church because he broke away, because remember the Pope would not allow him to divorce his wife Catherine. So that's what we're talking about there. Around the same time, Calvin shows up. And what do you know? Here we go again, Sky, right, with the coincidences. Well, what a coincidence that he just happened to be in Geneva at that time, and Knox happened to be in this place at that time, and Calvin happened to be there at that time. Zwingli happened to, it's all a godly coincidence. So we see how it all comes together. Calvin is there. Then we see Henry VIII dies. Edward becomes the king. And so this is kind of the Catholic side. It swings to Protestantism with Edward. Then he dies. It swings back to Catholicism with Bloody Mary. And the reforms are stopped. Then she dies. It goes to her sister Elizabeth, who is Protestant. And then we see the Protestant reforms and things start to happen in the church. But again, why this says this is because the Puritans weren't happy because the reform stopped, and they really didn't see anything breaking out from Catholicism. It was just, like you said, it was just still Catholicism, just with a couple little things that they could hang their hat on, changes, but not enough, and they stopped, and they didn't want to do it. Just like Zwingli. Just like why the Anabaptists got mad at Zwingli and separated from Zwingli was because of the same exact issue. Okay? So that's what we see happening. Then we will talk moving forward about some of this other stuff. Scottish reforms, we just talked about Knox and that happening. So here to answer your question, Adam, we'll get into that probably next week because we probably won't get through the Puritans here tonight. But King James is going to be the next king that takes over. So after Elizabeth dies, then that's the end of that lineage of the Tudors. That's the end of Henry VIII because he only has the 3 children. They all reign and they all die, and now his reign is over. He has no more heirs. So James comes in actually from Scotland. So James, it says James the First. He was actually James the Sixth, and he was king in Scotland before he came to England. He was married into Henry VIII. I believe he's the great-great-grandson, 2 or 3 great-grandson of Henry VIII. Okay, they married into one another. So James gets to then be heir of the throne in England. So he becomes called James the First in England. Okay, but he's the same person that was called James the Sixth, and he was ruler and king over Scotland. So he is made king of England. You see there in 1603, and we will get to him shortly, but that is who we're talking about. The King James Bible, that's who we're talking about, okay? And we'll get to that next week, probably. So his son then, Charles, becomes king after him, and again, we'll move forward on some of this, but some of this, Pete, was what you were referring to. This one, Adam, is the first kind of wave that you're talking about in the 1630s. The Puritans get so fed up that tens of thousands of them in this first thing leave and they go over. And that's the Mayflower and just these ships that leave and they go over, and a lot of the Puritans leave and go in that. And then there is a civil war that's going to ensue between the Puritans and the leaders in England. They just had enough, and it's going to come to war for several years. And then Pete was talking about that kind of 1650s.
That's actually, the war was to become parliamentarians and not to become subjects of
the monarchy.
Of the monarchy.
Exactly, and that's what this is, the Glorious Revolution. So what happens in here, what he's talking about is the monarchianism means, what does monarchianism mean, or what's monarch? Mono means one, right? So you have a king as a ruler, and they want to change the system and make it parliament, make it more government, make it more democratic. And so that's going to be happening at this time as well. And the Puritans are kind of doing okay in this. Then we have another monarchy. We have another man, Charles II, who becomes king. Then James II is going to become king. But then we're going to have what's called the Glorious Revolution, and that's the stuff that Pete's talking about, where they're going to break free from the monarchy system, and Parliament's going to come in. They're going to become more democratic. So I don't know that we'll touch much on that. So, but we will talk about these kings of England a little bit more moving ahead. So hopefully that first half at least is helpful to see how the ping pong match went and see where we are up to this point where we're here. Okay, so we're here and we'll unpack that next week. Questions on that? Thoughts? I know it's a little blurry, but I couldn't actually find that. It's the Master's Seminary, where I took that course, and I couldn't find a slide on that anywhere, so I had to go back and watch the video, and that's actually a screenshot from my phone of my TV. So that's why it's a little, you can see the blues all kind of funny looking.
So the lineage with the kings and stuff, they basically have to be born of a male king. Like, you had Elizabeth there, she didn't have any kids that could pass along from her lineage?
Right. Right.
Had to be, the name comes from a man, so then that died with the...
Right, because it was Henry Tudor, so it was Henry VIII, his lineage. So it's his bloodline that gets the throne. So once that bloodline is cut off by them not having any more males, then it's over. Or by force, somebody could come in and kill you and take the throne over. Like that certainly happened.
Well, they usually import, like when we got your man came out from Scotland, that they import someone else,
right,
of royal blood to...
Who was like a...
Marianne.
Yeah.
Right, because, like I said, James is Henry's, great-great-grandson, so he's actually related to them. So James is like Elizabeth's cousin, or whatever. See what I mean? So, and that's what he's saying. So they would find, the closest male relative, and that happened to be James. He just happened to be ruling in Scotland, and so now he's going to come and rule, because now he's in line, next in line male would be him, and so he comes and becomes the king of England.
And I have to mix it up a bit, otherwise there's a bunch of retarded people doing the, I have to mix the bloodline up a little bit.
Yep.
Right.
Because it gets pretty
inbred.
yeah.
Yep.
Whatever it takes to get them in.
Yeah.
You got a
Trying
boy.
to see how many. Okay, yeah, we will make it. We'll finish up on the Puritans. Let's do that. We got 5 minutes to wrap it up. Then we'll get into King James next week. We already talked about that. Puritans are very Calvinistic in their theology. And yeah, so here's where I was going with that earlier. We talked about that now. The Puritans have issues because, again, of the issues that they see with Catholicism, that they're not breaking free from those things. So they have a problem with the Catholic liturgy, remember the way that they do their service, the way they do their church, and the episcopal governance, that hierarchy of governance. Okay? They hang their hat on, at least the one thing they have is, and I put in there Puritans. If you think of the Puritans today, I mean, that's what we would call the conservative Christians. Okay? That's who the Puritans are. So we would all definitely relate to them. But that's also why, again, rewriting history and things, the narrative about them in today's world is very negative. You know, the liberals and the world that we live in today, they paint a very bad picture of the Puritans, and that's because they paint a bad picture of us as well. They don't think too highly of any of that. Okay, this is going to come into effect because, like I said, they don't agree with. If you picture kind of like, I think of dispensationalism, I always talk about the 3 legs and 3 pillows. So if you have a stool and you have 3 legs, the Puritans they have this stool, and the 3 legs are the Catholic liturgy, so they don't like that. Then they have the second one is the episcopal governance. They don't like that. The third one is Calvinistic theology. They love that. They like that. So at least the church has Calvinistic theology and teachings and stuff like that. So they're hanging in there by a thread on one leg, if you will, of the stool. Okay? And we're going to see that very shortly that's going to actually be kicked out for them. And that's what's going to cause their movement. Okay? So Elizabeth dies, and we'll talk just a moment here about him because we're going to get into James next week. But when Elizabeth dies, King James is going to take over. Now, this is this is reason for hope for the Puritans, because where did I already mention that James is coming from? He's coming from Scotland. Who's in Scotland? John Knox. Scotland is certainly Reformed and certainly Calvinistic and certainly much farther along in the Reforms than England. So they're like, hey, this he's leading Scotland, and that's who we want to be. This guy's coming over to be king over us. This is going to be great for us. Okay, so they have high hopes that James will bring them more reforms and that he will bring the changes that they desire to see happen in the church. And we'll leave you on the cliff right there until next week, or until you go home and Google it for yourself, and we'll talk about it next week to see if that actually happens. Thoughts, comments, questions? I'll kind of give you a spoiler alert because it's going to be a whole week from now, so we'll teach it again and talk about it next week. But that's what's going to happen. What's going to happen is Arminianism comes in. So for a lot of us that have these discussions, this is how this worked out historically. Jacobus of Arminius is a man who comes in Scotland and England, he starts teaching a different view than Calvin's view of soteriology. What are we talking about? Soteriology, salvation. Calvin, again, remember Reformed theology, that God chooses people. You are incapable of choosing God. You are a sinner. And without God stepping in and intervening, no one can be saved. Well, Arminius comes in and says that we are men and we are free will beings, and therefore we can choose to accept to follow God and choose Jesus if we want to. Two total different sides of the coin here, in which most of us are aware of that discussion and debate that still goes on in the church today. And it went on well before Calvin and Arminius. It was Pelagius and Augustine, and on and on and on and on. So it's nothing new. But what happens is Arminianism becomes the new hot thing, and in England and Scotland it starts to take over. So what happens to the Puritans is England now is going to make a shift, and they're no longer going to be Calvinistic in their view. They're going to be Arminianists. And so they don't like the liturgy. They don't like the governance structure. The one leg they had was their strong theology, and now that's gone. and the leg's kicked out and their stool is gone, and they say, we're out of here. And that's essentially the last straw that makes them jump ship and go to America. So
But it's not
that's
James.
the Cliff Notes
that
version.
does- It's not James that brings that thought in.
Nope.
It's the next one, Charles.
You'll see. It'll be both of them kind of leading that way. Yep.
In Scotland, though, Presbyterians are pretty strict.
Yep.
I was working up in on the Island of Skye, and they wouldn't let me bring my van there on Sunday because there had tools in it. So you can come over, but you can't bring your tools. You can't work on Sunday. And I just
They
drove
grabbed
like
that from the
1,000 miles
Hebrew
to get
religion.
there, did a job in it, I'm like, "You kidding me?" And I had to wait another day for it to even work. They didn't make me go to church, but wouldn't let me work.
That's out of the
Well-
Old Testament,
That's the
but it's
Sabbath.
not the New
Why
Covenant.
won't you work on the Sabbath?
That's, I mean, yeah, it's great. It's great when you